on the relational placement of those particular things. Now, let's dive in. So we've already covered a lot of stories this year in Come Follow Me, and let's take a look at where we've been so far and where we're going in the future. So we began in the New World with the entrance in the land of the first inheritance, back in the end of 1st Nephi. Then you got the great split of the Nephites and Lamanites in chapter 5 of 2nd Nephi, where Nephi tells us he traveled many days' journey into the wilderness.
Strictly speaking, standing here, I'm in South Korean territory. But if I step beyond this table here, in theory, I'm inside North Korea. Although practically speaking, the mysterious country of North Korea lies beyond that guarded and locked door over there. So, how come such a bizarre situation exists here? Well, the fact is that North and South Korea are still officially at war, and have been for more than half a century. Before the Second World War, the entire Korean peninsula was under the control of Japan. But when Japan was defeated, the victors divided the country along this line of latitude here, the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union sponsored a communist regime up here in the north, under Kim Il-sung in his capital Pyongyang, and the Americans put Syngman Rhee, a fiercely right-wing nationalist, in control of South Korea in his capital, Seoul.
Syngman Rhee wanted to govern not just South Korea, but the entire peninsula. He wanted to unite North and South under a capitalist regime. In the North, his opposite number and bitter enemy, Kim Il-sung, also wanted to unify the Korean peninsula, but under the banner of communism.
Each man had his dream of unifying Korea under his rule, but neither of them did very much about it. Until just after 4 a.m. on the 25th of June 1950, when, without any warning, North Korea invaded the South.
Within hours, 130,000 men of the North Korean army were pouring across the border. The North Korean army caught the South Koreans utterly unprepared.
With all those who would follow him, and after many days they founded a place and they called it the city of Nephi and the land of Nephi. So the Nephites are going to be here in this city and land of Nephi and Shiloh and this region for about 400 years, until the Lamanite aggressions and wars become so bad that in about 200 BC, the Lord inspires King Mosiah, Benjamin's father, to leave the land of Nephi and travel northward. And the distance between Nephi and Zarahemla, based on other stories that we've covered in the Book of Mormon so far, like Limhi and Alma after Abinadi's story, tells us that it's about a 21-day or a 3-week journey to get from Nephi to Zarahemla.
The South Koreans could barely muster a fighting force. Outgunned and overwhelmed by enemy tanks, the ill-equipped army were rapidly forced back.
Even though we fired our guns at them, the tanks were not damaged at all. We could not destroy them. We were in a panic. We couldn't resist the enemy. It was terrifying.
In just 48 hours, the communist soldiers were poised to attack the South Korean capital, Seoul. Seoul was the jewel in the crown of South Korea, and the North Korean army's attack on it was swift and certain. The communists burst through these narrow streets, meeting little resistance as they took control. The North Korean troops swamped the city. And by June the 28th, just 3 days after the invasion, communist flags were flying over Seoul. But the North Koreans didn't stop here in Seoul. They pushed on southwards, aiming to take the whole peninsula in the name of communism. They crossed rivers, they traversed mountains, and they defeated the weak South Korean army at every encounter. For the North Koreans, it was beginning to look like a walkover.
So that kind of gives you an idea of the distance and the spread. We also get some clues about this land of Nephi where they first settled, in that when King Limhi's people escaped, the Lamanite soldiers who followed them northward into the wilderness, after a day, they get lost in the wilderness and they're so confused, they can't follow Limhi's group, and they also can't figure out how to get back home to Nephi, to the land of Nephi, city of Nephi rather. So the land had to be such that they were totally disoriented and they wandered for many days until they found Amulon. So that just kind of gives you the lay of the land in the south part.
The West and its allies feared the North's seizure of South Korea would be another dangerous advance of communism throughout the world. And the West was determined to do something about it.
The Americans took the lead in persuading the United Nations to go to the defense of South Korea. Now, the Soviet Union could have vetoed this proposal, but they weren't there. In the Soviet Union's absence, the vote was passed. For the first time, the United Nations was going to war.
21 nations from around the world, including Britain, would send men and equipment to Korea. But there would be no doubt as to who would be in charge. America, by far the biggest single force, was in command.
The fighting in Korea was no longer a small skirmish in a far-flung country. It had dragged in a superpower.
Within days, Allied troops began to flood into South Korea. American troops were the first of the UN forces to arrive in Korea, shipped in from their bases in nearby Japan. And they entered here, through Korea's southernmost port, Pusan. When they landed, they faced a desperate situation, and it was getting worse, because by now, the South Korean army had almost totally collapsed under the advance of the North Korean steamroller. But the American troops were virtually powerless to improve matters, because these were not the same battle-hardened, well-equipped men that had been victorious in the Second World War.
We had equipment left over from World War II, most of which had been in a warehouse someplace, and it was from unserviceable to non-existent. We were in a very poor shape for everything. We were not ready to fight a war. That's the long and the short of it.
Just weeks after setting foot on Korean soil, the American land forces faced a terrible humiliation. By now, the North Koreans controlled nearly the whole of the Korean peninsula. And this meant that the American troops and their South Korean allies were packed into an increasingly tight corner, an area that became known as the Pusan perimeter. This was a tiny pocket of land, just 50 miles by 50 miles around the port of Pusan in the southernmost tip of the peninsula. Everywhere else was in North Korean hands. The United Nations forces were surrounded and in danger of being pushed out of Korea altogether.
What was needed to rescue the United Nations forces from disaster was a bold stroke from a decisive leader. And that's exactly what they got from the man in charge, the American General Douglas MacArthur.
MacArthur was one of those commanders who was larger than life. He was America's most decorated officer in the First World War, and he relished the fame he'd won, leading the defeat of Japan in the Second World War. Now the Korean War gave the aging general a chance of yet another triumph.
MacArthur knew that if he was to push Kim Il-sung's Communist Army back into North Korea, he'd have to come up with a much more ambitious strategy than simply battling it out on the Pusan perimeter.
So the majority of the rest of the Book of Mormon story is going to take place here in the land of Zarahemla, including that long section at the end of Alma that we're going to cover later on about the war chapters. Now let me give you some examples of where this geographical reference point, this internal map, can help us make a little better sense of those war chapters. If you turn to Alma chapter 22, verse 27, all the way over to 35, happens to be the single most densely packed in section of the entire Book of Mormon regarding geography. It's where Mormon, the abridger, pauses in his story, where he's been telling the story of Lamoni, and now in chapter 22, King Lamoni's father, and that king over all the Lamanite lands becoming converted, and he pauses to now describe some of these geographical features. So you'll notice in verse 27, where we pick this up, the king is going to send this proclamation throughout all of his land. So keep in mind, this is the land of Nephi, where the Lamanites live. Notice how he describes it here. He sent this proclamation throughout all the land amongst all his people who were in all his land, who were in all the regions round about, which was bordering even to the sea on the east and on the west. So you'll notice the land of Nephi needs to stretch from the sea on the east to the sea to the west, coast to coast. And look at its northern border. It says it was divided from the land of Zarahemla by a narrow strip of wilderness which ran from the sea east even to the sea west and roundabout on the borders of the seashore. You'll notice that this little narrow strip of wilderness, it needs to run all the way from sea to sea, whatever that wilderness is, whether it's a mountain range, whether it's a desert, a swamp, a jungle, whatever the wilderness is, it's got to go from sea to sea.
In January 1973, 50 insurgents armed with machine guns, rockets, and mortars obliterated an entire police base in the Caprivi, now Zambezi, region near Zambia. Despite being veterans of the Rhodesian Bush War, the police defenders were soundly defeated. When reports got back to Pretoria, the South Africans were furious. If the insurgents wanted a fight, the South African army was going to give it to them.
Separating these two lands, okay? Notice also that it runs through the borders of Manti by the head of the river Sidon, running from the east towards the west, and thus were the Lamanites and the Nephites divided. So you'll notice Manti is always listed somewhere near that narrow strip, that dividing point. It's one of the entry points between the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla.
In World War II, MacArthur's greatest victories had been achieved through amphibious landings, sending troops in by sea to attack behind enemy lines. Such landings carried grave risks, but MacArthur was convinced he had mastered the technique.
MacArthur now proposed to use the same strategy in Korea, with a bold attempt to take the pressure off his forces trapped in this chokehold in the southeast of the peninsula. He would deliver an amphibious hammer blow, not down here around Pusan, but 150 miles behind enemy lines to the northwest, at the port city of Incheon.
And it's always listed, Manti always seems to be associated with the head of the River Sidon. Now, a quick word about the River Sidon. It says there at the bottom of verse 27, through the borders of Manti by the head of the River Sidon, running from the east towards the west. You could interpret the word head of the river as a confluence. In antiquity, they would do that. They would see a confluence as a head of the river, or a branching point of a river, like in the book of Genesis. After the creation, the river that came forth, and it formed a head that went into 4 different directions. So it can be a spreading out point, or it can be a beginning point, or it can be a confluence point. However you want to interpret that, totally fine. We have chosen on this particular map to depict the head of the river being the beginning point of the river flowing from the east towards the west in the region of Manti near the narrow strip of wilderness, based on this. Again, you're seeing lots of judgment calls have to be made as you're doing this, and that's all they are. They're not absolute truths. They're judgment calls. Look at verse 28. Now the more idle part of the Lamanites lived in the wilderness and dwelled in tents, and they spread through the wilderness on the west in the land of Nephi, over here, yea, and also on the west in the land of Zarahemla. So there's a wilderness on the west in Nephi and a wilderness on the west in Zarahemla.
If he could seize Incheon, his troops could move on to Seoul, a mere 20 miles inland, cut the North Koreans off from behind, and force them to fight on 2 fronts, here and here. The North Koreans would be surrounded and crushed.
Notice also that it spreads in the borders by the seashore and on the west of the land of Nephi. Down he comes to the south again, in the place of their father's first inheritance, and thus bordering along by the seashore. So
By now, the Allied forces pinned down inside the Pusan perimeter had been reinforced with fresh battle-ready troops. They broke out and thrust north to join those who'd recaptured Seoul.
The United Nations forces could now attack the North Korean troops from 2 directions. Kim Il-sung's army was effectively surrounded and quickly collapsed.
Within just 2 weeks, the Allies had pushed the crumbling North Korean army back over the 38th parallel, back into North Korea. It was an incredible turnaround. The 2 Koreas were now back where they began, divided by the 38th parallel.
he's describing this whole western front, it seems, in this segment, where there are wildernesses and the Lamanites are dwelling in tents there, and even down to the point of the land of the first inheritance, which seems to be on the west of the land of Nephi. Why? Because now we shift in 29 to the other side, to the east.
The question for the UN allies was what to do next. The United Nations could have ended the war right there, but MacArthur wanted to press on. He didn't just want to kick communism out of South Korea, but crush it in North Korea as well. He said the North should pay the penalty for invading the South. He urged the United Nations to take the war across the border. At the end of September 1950, MacArthur got his way. He was given the go-ahead to cross the 38th parallel and push into North Korea. The UN army were no longer repelling an invasion. They had themselves become the invaders.
The Allied invasion of North Korea began very well. On October the 7th, the main body of the United Nations force drove northwards, and within a month they'd overrun the communist capital, Pyongyang. Still they pressed on, scattering any North Koreans who opposed them. The United Nations forces were now within reach of fulfilling MacArthur's vision of a total victory over communism and a united anti-communist Korea.
Word went around that MacArthur had even promised his troops would be home by Christmas, in a month's time.
But every step his men took north threatened to awaken a sleeping dragon.
MacArthur's troops were now fast approaching the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and Communist China.
Notice, and also there were many Lamanites on the east by the seashore, whither the Nephites had driven them. And thus the Nephites were nearly surrounded by the Lamanites. Nevertheless, the Nephites had taken possession of all the northern parts of the land. So you'll notice that the Nephites have possession of the land of Zarahemla on the north, and there's the wilderness on the west, there's a wilderness on the east, and then there's the narrow strip of wilderness that separates Zarahemla from the land of Nephi. And the Lamanites have started to fill in these wilderness areas, dwelling in the tents surrounding the Nephites, kind of like a horseshoe.